Now, another difference between social movements and more general collective behavior is that they are deliberate. The majority of collective behavior is not, meaning the majority is not planned ahead of time, where participants really weigh the pros and cons of joining. Social movements openly try to get as many people as possible to actively join them, or at least passively support them. And again, this planning is usually not present in most other collective behavior. The majority of collective behavior is not well planned and executed. Now, there's always exceptions. So when we look at Jim Jones and the People's Temple in Guyana in the 1970s, clearly he had to have planned to have all that poison with him. And it was later discovered he had been getting regular shipments of it for a long time before most of his followers had even moved there. And what he did was he obtained a jeweler's license to get it because cyanide is used to clean gold. And even though there were no gold mines or anything to do with jewelry, he got it. And in addition, the doctor at Jonestown wrote in a memo to Jones well before the deaths, and this is a direct quote: "Cyanide is one of the most rapidly acting poisons. I would like to give about 2 grams to a large pig to see how effective our batch is." So there's always exceptions to the rule. But apart from a few specific instances, the vast majority of collective behavior is not planned. It just isn't. Fads, crazes, mobs, riots, panics, hysterias, religious apparitions, and images and miracles. Something else that sets social movements apart is that they're usually enduring. The majority of collective behavior does not last very long. The vast majority is relatively brief. Obviously, riots and crowds do not last long, some longer than others. The riots in LA in reaction to the police officers who assaulted Rodney King lasted several days. Sports riots usually last a few hours. Fads and crazes last longer than a riot, but still not very long overall. The vast majority of collective behavior, even that which lasts longer than a day, still fades out over time rather quickly. Social movements can last for years, decades, and the civil rights movement in the US is a good example of this. Were attempts made to improve the civil rights of people of color before the 1950s? Sure, absolutely. But most view 1954 as the kind of unofficial beginning of the civil rights movement in the US, because that is when the decision for Brown versus the Board of Education was decided by the Supreme Court. So to give you a little bit more background on that, it ruled that any US state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools were unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools were otherwise equal in quality. So this idea of separate but equal, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that doesn't do it. So it was no longer left up to individual states to decide whether their school would continue as segregated or not. Brown versus Board of Education started in Topeka, Kansas, when a man named Oliver Brown took his child to the school that was closest to their home, as everybody did and still does. And he tried to register her instead of having to bus her to another school further away that was all black. Mr. Brown and 12 other black families then filed a lawsuit against the Board of Education, which they lost. And then they took the case to the Supreme Court, which clearly they won. And I don't think any of us, myself included, can really understand and appreciate the significance of that one particular Supreme Court decision. This was a huge victory for the civil rights movement, and it's generally viewed as the beginning of it. Maybe I should be more specific. It was generally viewed as the beginning of the tide beginning to turn. Even though, of course, attempts at equal rights had been made for decades before. So with 1954 viewed as the kind of beginning of the turning of the tide, it continued right through to the late 60s with the Freedom Riders and the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955 to 56, and sit-ins and voter registration drives and others. So it really, a social movement really can last for a long time. Now, all social movements are not the same. There are actually different kinds. So just as an analogy, like riots and mobs might at first glance seem the same, but they're different, different in purpose and different in behavior. So for example, we could classify some of them as an alternative social movement. An alternative social movement tries to create change in thoughts or behavior in a specific area. So it's trying to partially change, not totally change, individual behavior, not society as a whole. So this kind of movement has a pretty narrow focus in terms of who they want to influence. If you think of the Black Lives Matter movement, this is a movement with more than one focus. It's looking at eliminating racial profiling by the police, eliminating unfair treatment in police interactions, reshaping policing overall, a whole bunch of things. And for each one of these goals, they in themselves entail several different subcategories. That's not an alternative social movement. An alternative social movement is really narrow in its focus. And because of this, these are movements that are pretty unthreatening, pretty unconfrontational. They're not something that's likely going to cause a whole lot of opposition in society, but they can still be pretty influential. Alcoholics Anonymous is something that tries to partially change individual behavior. Your text uses the example of the DARE program, drug abuse resistance education, which is pretty well known, but at the same time, it's pretty limited. Now, this actually began in Los Angeles, in LA, as an education program to prevent the use of controlled drugs, membership in gangs, and violent behavior. It began in 1983. Here in Canada, we're not used to that. We generally just think of it as a program kids here have here in elementary and middle school to not do drugs. Now, when it was founded, it was a joint initiative of the police chief of LA, Daryl Gates, who we have talked about in relation to the Rodney King beating, and the local school district. And it was really evolved as part of the American War on Drugs, a drug control strategy. And in the US, at the beginning, it operated very differently than what we are now used to in Canada. For example, believe it or not, children in the schools, this is in the 80s in the States, were asked to complete questionnaires that included questions about their home that encouraged them to tell their friends, teachers, or police if they found drugs at home or people they thought might be illegally using drugs. So DARE officers would put what they called a DARE box in every classroom so that students could anonymously put in notes with information about drugs in the community. And this was really viewed that essentially students were enlisted as informants against their parents. And believe it or not, sometimes this happened. In October 2010, an elementary school in North Carolina had a student that brought cannabis to school to turn his parents in. So this was an 11-year-old student who was in grade 5, and he brought his parents joints to school when he reported them. After a lesson about marijuana was delivered by a police officer as part of the DARE program at that school. Police arrested the kid's mom and dad. Both were charged with 2 misdemeanor counts each of marijuana possession and possession of drug paraphernalia. They weren't jailed, and they were released on a written promise to appear in court. But both the 11-year-old and his sibling were removed from the parents' house by social services. So at first we kind of laugh at that and say, oh my God, could you imagine? But I mean, it had very real consequences. Now, the DARE program, as it originally began, was deemed largely ineffective by the vast majority of research. There were simply no concrete indications it was having the desired effect. And since then, it's changed quite significantly, actually revised by a sociologist, so that now it's quite different, and it can really vary depending on where you live. In some areas, the DARE program can focus more on bullying, cyberbullying, suicide prevention. Depending where you live, it might focus on the opioid epidemic or mass shooting awareness. And again, it depends on where it's being implemented. In Canada, it's still a drug abuse resistance education program implemented in classrooms and led by a police officer. So DARE is an example of an alternative social movement that generally focuses on one social issue, drugs, and not even the issue as a whole, but one particular subset of the drug issue, drug use amongst young people, which is a pretty narrow focus. That's why DARE is considered an alternative social movement. A redemptive social movement tries to create dramatic social change by completely transforming people, but only particular individuals. So an alternative social movement focused on individuals in part. A redemptive social movement focused on individuals in whole. It really seeks a total personal transformation for people, and usually they're religious in nature. And alternative social movements, they want to partially change individual behavior. Again, redemptive, totally change individual behavior. If you attended DARE or joined a DARE organization, that would be fine. It's not going to completely alter your life. But if you have a religious movement that promises salvation through a complete personal transformation, religious organizations that openly attempt to convert people into being a member, they want to totally transform the life of a new member, and as a member, they are indeed transformed. But non-members stay the same. The rest of the world stays the same. If you think of really fundamental evangelical religious groups, the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas, follows primitive Baptist principles and seems to focus a lot of its energy on anti-gay protests, which includes, for example, picketing military funerals, celebrity funerals, and various other public events, even for people who are not gay. And on Sundays, they picket other churches. Now, they picket military funerals because they view the death as an example of God's punishment that occurs because the United States as a whole has lost its morals. They picketed at some of the funerals after the shooting at Sandy Hook School. They went to the funerals of the children who died at the shooting because they felt it was God's judgment due to the state standing up for gay marriage. So they want to convert people to their faith. They want to totally transform the lives of their members, but are, for the most part, focused on these particular individuals. In your text is a picture of men who are members of an evangelical Christian organization for men called the Promise Keepers. They describe themselves as, quote, a Christ-centered organization dedicated to introducing men to Jesus Christ as their Savior and Lord, helping them to grow as Christians, end quote. So this is a really traditional organization in that it really advocates for chastity, marital fidelity, and the man being the head of the household. This is actually pretty recent. It began in 1990. And the Promise Keepers emphasizes what it refers to as godly manhood and fatherhood. By godly manhood, it emphasizes two kinds of manhood. So the first is focused on aggression, strength, and rationality. The second is focused on expressive manhood, which says that all the traits now traditionally attributed to women were actually practiced by Jesus, and that men should reconnect with their sensitive side. And in regards to fatherhood, the organization tends to be more conservative, still supporting heterosexist male dominance in the family. So that's another example of a redemptive social movement. A reformative social movement wants to change society in one way. Not all of society. They're focused on something particular in society that they want to change. An example would be the women's suffrage movement, the movement for women to gain the right to vote. They merely wanted to change a part of the system. They wanted to have equal voting rights, the same as men. The environmental movement is a movement focused on change at a societal level, but only part of society. Buy Nothing Day, which protests the rampant consumerism demonstrated on Black Friday. So they may seek a more limited change, but they are targeting the entire population. And I think these are the social movements most of us think about because a reformative movement focuses on a particular topic or issue, but just that one. They're not trying to change the entire world, all of the society in which they exist, just a part of it, whether it's a behavior or an attitude. For example, MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Most of you are probably not old enough to remember when MAD first really took off and began to spread, but in the 80s, this truly was a reformative social movement. And it just flew and spread everywhere, not only in terms of laws regarding drinking and driving, but in terms of changing society's attitude towards it. That's key. It had very specific goals, both legal and social. The social goals were really the most difficult because you had an entire society in which, for the most of it, well, drinking and driving wasn't viewed as a great thing to do. It also wasn't looked down upon the way it is now. There was certainly a segment of society who viewed it very negatively, the way most of our society does now. But even if caught, it was not considered a really serious, shameful offense. So, hey, did you hear Jen got caught driving home from the bar last weekend? Spent the night in the drunk tank. Ha ha ha. Yeah, her mom was ticked. Now, that never happened. I'm just doing that to demonstrate the attitude. Now, if somebody's caught drinking and driving, it's viewed as a very, very serious offense, not just legally, but socially speaking. And that's an incredibly important distinction to make because legal change and social change do not always go hand in hand. When desegregation of schools occurred in the American South, it was not met all around by cheers of yippee. In fact, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the 9 Black students who attended the white high school the first year were each assigned their own personal soldier to accompany them everywhere for their own safety because social attitudes were behind legal attitudes. So these days, when you think of somebody drinking and driving and getting caught, it's considered highly embarrassing, extremely shameful, not something a person would want made public in any way. You wouldn't want people at work to know, or your family, or your neighbors. So part of the goal of MAD was to create a better society with changing one part of it, albeit a small part, but still a part that resulted in a better society. And to change the attitude of a society overall is really quite remarkable. Other examples of positive reformative social movements include the women's suffrage movement, civil rights movement, but they're all also examples of a negative reformative social movement, like the white supremacist, white separatist movement, which did initially begin with the same goal as more positive examples. So if you look at the white supremacist movement, it seeks to change one part of society, to reform it, in its eyes for the betterment of all society. And that's the problem. What they consider better for the rest of society is not the way the rest of society sees it. When you look at the development of the Ku Klux Klan, most people know it formed sometime after the Civil War in the US in an effort to maintain whatever white supremacy was left, as well as to try to restore it. It was trying to reform a part of society. And since then, it's failed miserably. It has declined in membership and popularity, and then sometimes we'll have a surge in membership and popularity. One of its goals now is to take an active anti-immigration stance. Another kind of social movement is a revolutionary social movement. So this is focused on all of society and everything about society, not just part of it. It wants to really redesign the social order with a new one. And this is also sometimes called a transformative social movement, so it means the same thing. So a revolutionary social movement seeks total change, a total change in social systems. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds like a reformative social movement. So an easy way to determine the difference is that people that are involved in a reformative movement usually want to be included equally with the current system because they're just focused on a part. A revolutionary social movement wants to somehow change or destroy the current system altogether rather than just being included in it. And if you think of the term revolution itself, it has several definitions. A fundamental change in power or organizational structure that occurs in a short period of time. A radical and pervasive change in society and the social structure, especially one made suddenly and often accompanied by violence. A forcible overthrow of a government or social system in favor of a new system. So note that every definition of a revolution includes some reference to speed, to it happening fairly quickly. And it also includes reference to the complete elimination of one version for another. So this really is an all or nothing approach. And normally when we hear the revolution, with the term revolution, we think of political or socioeconomic revolutions, like the French Revolution, a period of radical social and political upheaval in France from about 1789 to 1799, where you had this all-powerful monarchy and church system, and they were destroyed and replaced by concepts of democracy. The Russian Revolution of 1917, when the ruling monarch, the Tsar, and his system were eliminated and replaced with a Bolshevik communist government. Some revolutions, however, are not successful. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1999, in which a revolution was attempted but failed, largely led by students, but also supported by others in China, all of whom wanted more government accountability, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and the restoration of workers' control over industry. At one point, it's estimated there were 1 million people participating in this one area, and it spread to hundreds of cities in China. And one of the things the Tiananmen Square protest is really remembered for is Tank Man. So on the left, the middle picture and the bottom picture, that is Tank Man. To this day, his identity has not been verified. He had the courage to actually stand in front of an entire column of tanks. So the tanks came to a stop, and this man gestured towards the tanks with his bags, and that led the tank at the front to try to drive around the man, but the man repeatedly stepped into the path of the tank. And he did this as a demonstration of non-violent action, very similar to what took place in the southern states when, no matter what was done to them, civil rights activists refused to retaliate with violence. So after repeatedly attempting to go around rather than crush the man, the lead tank stopped its engines and the armored vehicles behind it seemed to follow suit. And there was this kind of pause because it was like the tank man and the tank seemed to have kind of reached an impasse. Having successfully brought the column to a halt, the man climbed onto the hull of the lead tank and, after briefly stopping at the driver's hatch, appeared in video footage of the incident to call into various ports of the tank's turret. And then he climbed on top of the turret and seemed to have a short conversation with a crew member at the gunner's hatch. And then, after the conversation, he descended from the tank. The tank commander briefly emerged from his hatch. The tanks restarted their engines, ready to continue. But at that point, the man, who was still standing about a meter or two from the side of the lead tank, leapt in front of the vehicle once again and kind of re-established the standoff. And then video footage showed that 2 figures in blue then pulled the man away and disappeared with him into a crowd, and the tanks continued on their way. Now, at first, the Chinese government kind of tolerated what was going on, but then they declared martial law, which essentially means they can use military power to disperse the crowds. And 300,000 troops were sent into Beijing. The government conducted widespread arrests of protesters and their supporters. They cracked down on other protests around China, expelled foreign journalists from the country, and very quickly and strictly controlled coverage of the events in the domestic press. Anyone in the government thought to be sympathetic to the protests were demoted or simply fired, and political reforms were largely halted, and economic reforms were halted as well. So in China, this is just showing that you cannot find any reference to the Tiananmen Square protest in China at all. They've just completely 100% erased any mention of it. So all of these revolutions, however, had the same goal in mind, or at least the same result: to completely change society, and sometimes the very basis on which the society was based.